tonight. We journey far beyond the shining temples and heroic myths of ancient Greece. Beneath the glory of marble columns and the applause of public arenas lies a tale too haunting to be sung aloud. A tale not of warriors or kings, but of one forgotten boy, trapped in a golden cage. His name has been lost to time, but his suffering echoes still. This is the tragic life of a male concubine in ancient Greece. The story begins not with grandeur, but silence. A boy sat alone on a wooden cart, the wheels creaking beneath him as two oxen pulled the load through a dry, winding road, cutting across the low hills of Thessaly. He was no more than 10, perhaps 11, his wrists bound with leather straps, too tight for comfort, but not tight enough to bruise. His eyes, wide and brown, darted from tree to tree, from shadow to sunlight. He had been taken 3 days earlier. A raid, swift and unannounced, had swept through his village. His mother's screams still echoed in his ears. His father, a farmer, had tried to fight back. The boy never saw him fall, but he felt that he would never see him again. His name was Nicandros, a common name, one of no importance. One that would soon be erased and replaced by whatever suited the house that purchased him. For now, the slaver called him the Quiet One. Other children sat on the cart with him, some crying, some sleeping, others blank and hollow, already detached from the world. Among them were girls and boys of various ages, but none as small and slight as Nicandros. That, unfortunately, made him valuable. The city they arrived in was Larissa, not as renowned as Athens, but wealthy in its own right, filled with landowners, scholars, retired generals, and merchants who had all tasted power and now sought the fruits of it behind closed doors. Slaves here were not just laborers. They were investments, ornaments, and for the rare few playthings the market they were dragged to smelled of sweat, perfume, and wine. Overhead, colored cloths flapped in the breeze, casting red and blue shadows across the pale stones beneath them. The children were washed, their hair oiled, and clothes stripped. No names were spoken, no pasts allowed. Nicandros was sold before the sun touched its zenith. A man in a purple chiton had walked past. Twice before he stopped. He was older, but not elderly, his face smooth but his eyes like flint. He asked to inspect the boy, then tilted Nicandros's chin upward with 2 fingers. The boy didn't flinch. That sealed the deal. Coins clinked into a leather pouch, and just like that, Nicandros was no longer free. The man's name was Diodoros, a philosopher by title, a collector by nature. He taught rhetoric to sons of aristocrats, but indulged his darker pleasures in silence. Nicandros was taken not to a kennel or barn, but to a private villa outside the city, nestled in a grove of olive trees. It was quiet there, and in the mornings, the chirping of birds masked the unnatural stillness of the boy's new world. Diodoros did not touch him, not at first. That would have been crude. The grooming began with gifts, honeyed figs, soft linens, a feather mattress. Nicandros was bathed each morning by older boys, former captives, who now moved with the obedience of trained animals. They dressed him, combed his hair, taught him to walk gracefully, to speak in low tones, to smile when spoken to. The villa was filled with silence, with control. And when he cried at night, no one came. Months passed like mist. Nicandros learned to play the lyre. He learned to recite verses from Homer and Euripides. He memorized the preferences of Diodoros, the wine he liked, the precise way he liked the room scented with myrrh before he entered. Everything the boy did was designed to please, not out of love, not even out of fear, but because survival was the only language he had left. By the time he turned 12, the household had changed. He was no longer the new boy. Others had come, new faces, new eyes that carried the same haunted glaze he once bore. The villa became a carousel of beautiful children, their lives rotating through Diodoros's tastes and interests. Some stayed only months before they were sent to other households, traded like wine amphorae, sometimes for gold, sometimes for favors. Nicandros remained. He had grown, and in doing so, he had become more valuable. His body no longer resembled that of a child, nor yet a man. That in-between phase, in Greek society, was considered the height of male beauty. His skin, kept pale and untouched by sun, gleamed like marble. Diodoros began taking him to symposiums not as a guest, but as part of the spectacle. The symposium was the heart of elite male pleasure. Cloaked in philosophy, poetry, and political banter, it was, at its core, a theater of indulgence. Men reclined on couches, drank wine diluted with snowmelt, and passed judgments on art, war, and always bodies. Young boys like Nicandros were expected to serve drinks, play music, entertain with light conversation, and offer more if requested. He did not resist. Resistance, after all, was never truly an option. He learned to laugh when prompted, to blush on cue, to bow his head when a hand brushed his shoulder. At one such gathering, he met a boy named Therence, lightly older, taller, with green eyes, like polished jade. Theron belonged to another household, but was trained in the same cruel ballet. They exchanged few words, but in passing moments, their eyes met. And for the first time in years, Nicandros felt something close to warmth. Disappeared after 3 weeks. It was whispered he had fought back against a guest. Diodoros never spoke of it, but the next night, he struck Nicandros for the first time, not out of rage, but out of routine, as though the boy had forgotten his place merely by remembering another's. The years did not pass like years, they slid together into a single, endless performance. By the time Nicandros turned 15, he no longer cried. He no longer remembered the name of his village or the color of his mother's eyes. His own reflection, polished and perfect, stared back at him like a stranger. His voice, once high and sharp, had settled into something softer, trained never to rise above a whisper unless commanded. And yet, somewhere deep inside, a small ember remained. It was not hope. Hope was dangerous, but a faint awareness, like a splinter in the soul, that this life was not meant to be a life, that he was not born for this, that somewhere, someone had failed him, and someone else had profited from that failure. One night, after a particularly opulent symposium, Diodoros summoned Nicandros alone. The villa was quiet, the other boys already asleep or dismissed. The philosopher was drunk more than usual and, his words slurred like oil on stone. He pulled Nic close, not cruelly, but with the gentle hunger of a man who believed he owned beauty. Nicandros, as always, obeyed, but something shifted. Diodoros called him by a name that was not his, perhaps a boy long gone, or one he hadn't yet owned. It didn't matter. In that moment, Nicandros realized, even his false name was not his own. Even his mask had a borrowed label. He smiled, as he was trained to, and offered the wine as expected. But deep inside, behind the practiced gaze, he quietly mourned for himself, not for what had been lost, but for the cruel fact that no one would ever know he existed. The sun rose over the olive groves as it always did, casting a golden hue upon the villa's whitewashed columns. Birds chirped in the branches above, oblivious to the sorrow below. The household stirred, servants rushing about with trays of fruit and wine, sweeping marble floors, fluffing pillows, refilling the fountains. The illusion of paradise was kept meticulously alive. But for Nicandros, it was another morning of performance, another morning of survival. He rose before dawn, as he always did. Not because he was told to, but because his body had been trained to wake to silence and obey it. He bathed in cool water, scrubbed his arms and neck, brushed the oil through his hair, and wrapped the fine cloth around his waist with precision. Diodorus liked symmetry. Sloppiness offended him, and punishment came swift for the smallest of missteps. Nicandros no longer thought of his reflection. His hands moved out of habit. His eyes scanned the room, not for beauty, but for alignment. He had become the art piece, smooth, silent, always present, never fully real. In the early years, he had tried to remember the names of others like him. Theron was the last he remembered. After him, the names blurred, faces replaced in weeks, sometimes days. They came younger, softer, less aware. Some didn't last. Some disappeared before their names could even settle in memory. The staff never spoke of them. The villa had no memory, only order. Diodorus rarely spoke to Nicandros during the day. His affections were nocturnal, his attentions rehearsed. By morning, he resumed the role of scholar, hosting students beneath the colonnades, lecturing on Platonic ideals, the moral state, the perfection of form. He would stand before eager young men, gesturing with passion, quoting Socrates, Aristotle, and Pythagoras. They listened, hungry for knowledge and status, unaware or perhaps willfully blind to the contradiction between the ideals he praised and the boy who poured his wine. At times, Nicandros would wonder whether the young men noticed him, whether they saw him as a shadow behind the curtains or an ornament against the wall, whether they knew he was once like them, a boy with a village, a name, a future. Sometimes he would catch a glance, a second too long, a flicker of recognition, or pity, or worse, desire. The glances meant nothing. No one ever asked about him. No one ever intervened. Years passed with painful clarity. Each day folded into the next. Nicandros became what Diodorus had molded him to be, obedient, graceful, invisible. But inside, the ember never died. That tiny splinter of faint memory of freedom clung to his soul like a whisper. And then, one evening, that whisper grew louder. It began with a visitor. His name was Alexius. He was a guest of one of Diodorus's students, a tall man in his late 20s, with broad shoulders and a quiet demeanor. He did not laugh as the others did. He didn't boast about his land or his horse. He watched, silently, as Nick moved about the symposium hall, refilling cups, collecting discarded figs, offering folded cloths to wipe sweat from brows. For most, Nicandros was air. But Alexios saw him. It wasn't just the way his eyes followed him. It was the restraint in his movements. The way he refused wine when others urged him. The way he listened, truly listened, to what was said. After 2 evenings of observation, he asked for Nicandros by name, not the false one Diodoros had given him, but his real name. Nicandros froze. No one had called him that in years. He turned slowly, unsure whether he had heard right. Diodoros, sitting a few feet away, hadn't noticed. The room was loud, filled with chatter and flutes and laughter. But Nicandros knew what he'd heard. Later that night, as he collected the empty amphorae from the colonnade, Alexios approached him again. This time, in a whisper. "You are not what they say," he said quietly, glancing around. Nicandros said nothing. He had long since learned the danger of hope. "I know where you're from, or close to it," Alexios added. "Your accent. It's Northern Phaeodus, maybe. I'm from Magnesia." Nicandros's hand trembled. He nearly dropped the amphora. "Don't speak now," Alexios said gently. "Just know this: I remember you. Years ago, there was a raid in your region. My uncle's men were nearby. You were taken, weren't you?" Nicandros couldn't breathe. For the first time in a decade, someone had seen the thread of his past and spoken it aloud. Alexios left him with a folded cloth, stuffed beneath it a small bronze coin. Nothing valuable, but symbolic. A promise of something more. For days, could not sleep. He turned the coin over in his palm again and again, memorizing its texture, its weight, its implication. But escape? That was impossible. The villa was guarded not heavily, but with enough subtlety to keep the boys in and the world out. The servants gossiped when they thought no one listened. Boys who tried to run were whipped, sold, or worse. Still, the idea lingered. Diodoros noticed the change. He commented once, his fingers brushing Nicandros's face with the cold affection of ownership. "You're quiet lately. That's good. I like quiet things." Nicandros smiled as required, but said nothing. Alexios returned a week later. This time, he came with a letter, folded into the heel of his sandal. He slipped it into Nicandros' hand during a false stumble. The note was short. "At dusk. 2 nights from now, East Grove. I'll be there. You choose." Nicandros's mind spun in every direction. Could he trust him? Was this a trap? Was it worse to believe, or worse, not to? That night, he lay awake, staring at the beams of the ceiling. The villa was silent. Outside, the wind rustled the olive leaves. Somewhere, an owl called, and somewhere further beyond, the world continued unaware that a boy without a name was about to make the most dangerous choice of his life. He didn't run, not immediately. 2 days passed, each moment stretched by the weight of decision. At times, he convinced himself not to go, that freedom was a lie, that Alexios was just another face in a parade of men who used and discarded. But then he would touch the coin, hidden beneath his tunic, and feel that ember flare again. The night came. Dusk bled across the sky, turning the white villa orange. The symposium was cancelled. Diodoros had a headache. That was luck. Nicandros waited until the lamps were lit, the villa hushed, and the servants withdrawn to their corners. Then he slipped out, barefoot, taking nothing but the cloth around his waist and the coin clenched in his hand. The grove was quiet. The air smelled of dust and dry bark. He moved like a shadow, the way he had been trained, silently, efficiently, invisibly. Alexios was there, waiting beside a low wall. A horse stood tied nearby. When he saw Nicandros, his face changed not with triumph, but with sorrow, as though he knew what the boy had lost just to be standing there. He held out his hand. Nicandros hesitated for only a moment, and then he ran, not toward freedom, toward possibility, toward a life not defined by obedience. They rode through the night, taking the coastal route to avoid the city. Alexios spoke little. Nicandros said even less, but in the silence between them, something bloomed. Not trust, not yet, but recognition. For the first time since childhood, Nicandros slept without fear, but freedom, he would learn, was not a destination. It was a fight, and some chains do not break simply by running. The morning air was cold and sharp, the scent of salt from the Aegean Sea lacing the breeze as Nicandros opened his eyes beneath the branches of a gnarled pine. His limbs ached from the ride, his fingers stiff from gripping the saddle, but for the first time in years, the pain felt honest. Not punishment, not routine, but the raw aftermath of movement, of action taken on his own will. Alexios stood nearby, tending to the horse and adjusting the saddle straps. He hadn't spoken much during the night, save for soft instructions. When to duck beneath branches, when to hold tighter, when to be still. Nicandros had obeyed, not from habit, but necessity. But now, as the sun rose gently behind the hills, casting golden lines across the rocky ground, he realized something strange. Alexios wasn't watching him. Not like Diadoros, not like the guests, not like the others. He looked past him. It unsettled Nicandros more than it should have. They didn't stay long. By the time the sun crested over the ridge, they were already riding again, slow, measured, always keeping to the side roads and goat paths. Alexios explained little. He wasn't cruel, just deliberate. His silence was the silence of someone who had seen too much, perhaps done too much, to be casual about anything. And yet, when he did speak, it was with a softness that felt foreign to Nicandros's ears. "We'll reach Phylake before sundown," he said as they passed a crumbled shrine along a cliff. "There's a man there who owes me more than a favor. You'll be safe a while." Safe. The word felt unreal. Nicandros turned it over in his mind like a foreign coin. Could safety exist for someone like him? Someone whose identity had been reshaped and rewritten so many times that even the word boy felt like a role rather than a truth. He wanted to ask, "Why are you doing this?" But the word stuck in his throat. Instead, he said nothing. Phylake was a humble village tucked between two ridges, a place of dusty streets and slate-roofed homes. Children played in the narrow alleys, goats bleated from behind stone fences, and the air buzzed with the smell of onions and wet soil. No one looked at Nicandros twice as he dismounted. No one pointed. No one whispered. To the world, he was just a tired youth traveling with an older man. His past didn't matter here, not yet. Alexios led him to a small cottage on the village edge. It belonged to a man named Parmenion, gray-haired, leathery-skinned, missing 2 fingers on his left, and he welcomed Alexios with a tight embrace and a few muttered oaths in Macedonian. Nicandros remained at the threshold until invited. Old habits clung like dust. Parmenion looked him over with a long, unreadable gaze. Not evaluative, not interested, just measuring. He'll stay, Alexios said plainly. Just for a while. Parmenion nodded. Fine, but I'm not feeding a second mouth out of charity. He can work, Alexios replied, before Nicandros could speak. And so, for the first time since he was taken from his village, Nicandros was given a task with no strings attached, hauling buckets from the well, fetching firewood, sweeping dust. From the stoop, the labor felt alien. His hands blistered easily, his joints ached from lack of practice. But no one watched him, no one corrected his posture or measured his footsteps. There was no expectation to entertain, no command to be beautiful. He was just ... there, a boy in the background of someone else's life, at night. Parmenion fed them lentils and barley bread. They spoke little. Nicandros ate quietly, ears perked, absorbing each word exchanged between the two older men. Spoke of the south, of unrest near Thebes, of corrupt magistrates and foreign traders pressing into land they didn't understand. Parmenion grunted, drank his wine, and reminded him that the world had always been filled with devours. Once. As Nicandros washed the clay bowls, Parmenion spoke to him for the first time directly. You know how to be quiet, he said. Not unkindly. That's rare. Nicandros nodded. You've seen bad things. Another nod. Parmenion paused. Then, with a shrug, added, that makes two of us. The days settled into rhythm. Labor, meal, sleep. No demands, no performances. And yet, a part of Nicandros didn't know what to do with the silence. It unnerved him. There was no applause, no cruel laughter, no eyes burning into his back. He found himself waking in the night, panicked, convinced someone was watching him, only to find the small room empty, lit only by the orange glow of a dying fire. Alexios came and went. Sometimes he stayed a day or two. Sometimes he was gone for weeks. He never explained where he went, and Nicandros never asked. He simply waited. Not because he depended on the man he wasn't sure he even trusted him fully, but because Alexios had become a tether. Proof that what happened in the villa was not the only reality. One night, Alexios returned bruised and limping. He said nothing about the injuries, only asked for wine and a cloth. Nicandros cleaned the wound on his shoulder in silence. The old instinct to obey returned, but this time, it was tinged with something else. Something gentler. A desire, not a command. Alexios flinched at the sting of vinegar. Did they teach you that too? He asked, half smiling. Nicandros looked at him. They taught me everything. The silence that followed was heavy. You ever think about going back? Alexios asked suddenly. Nicandros stiffened. To your home, wherever it was. Your family. I don't know if it's still there, he said. Or if they are. Alexios nodded. Yeah, me neither. That was the first time Nicandros learned anything of the man who saved him. Alexios had once been a soldier. Not a famous one, just another name on a roster. He'd fought under a local warlord during a northern campaign and witnessed what war really was. Not glory, but hunger and fire and ash. He'd defected after seeing a village burned for refusing tribute. That village, he suspected, had been Nicandros's. I saw your mother, he said, voice low. She tried to fight. Nicandros's heart stopped. She had a knife. Cut one of the men. He trailed off. I'm sorry. Nicandros said nothing. There was no scream inside him. Only a long, cold silence. In the weeks that followed, he worked harder, slept less, grew stronger. He began helping Parmenion in the nearby vineyards, learned how to tie vines, how to prune leaves without killing the fruit. His hands darkened from sun, thickened from use. He barely recognized them anymore, but with strength came memory, and memory brought rage. Not loud rage, not the kind that burned through villages, but the cold, enduring rage that settled deep in the marrow. The kind that did not scream or cry, but whispered, every night. They took everything from you. One morning, as he stood alone in the field, tying a low vine, he heard footsteps behind him. Alexios Parmenions sending me south again, he said. Nicandros nodded. I want you to come with me this time. Nicandros turned, eyes narrowed. Why? You've healed all you're going to hear, Alexios said simply. And there are others like you. Boys, not free yet. Caught in places worse than the villa you came from. I need someone who knows what that life is, who can spot it when I can't. Nicandros stared at him. You want me to help free them? No, Alexios replied. I want you to help fight for them. The word lodged in Nicandros's throat. Fight, not perform, not endure, not please. Fight, it sounded impossible. It sounded real. I don't know how you'll learn, Alexios said. So did I. Nicandros didn't answer that day, or the next. But the ember inside him once, so fragile, was no longer a spark. It had become a flame. The road south wound like a serpent through the hills, rising and falling with the rhythm of the land, cutting between groves, valleys, and time-worn ruins that whispered of lives long forgotten. The horses' hooves struck stone and dust in equal measure, and behind Alexios Nicandros rode silently, his hands more confident on the reins now, his spine no longer curled in submission but stretched by the slow reclaiming of his own posture. He had said yes, not with grand speeches, not with oaths or declarations, but with one quiet act. He packed his satchel, wrapped his sun-stained cloak around his shoulders, and mounted the horse beside Alexios before dawn. No one said goodbye. Parmenion had only grunted and handed him a small knife wrapped in cloth, saying nothing more than, "You'll need it." It was crude and short, its edge dulled by time, but to Nicandros it felt like the first true gift of his life. Alexios didn't smile when Nicandros joined him. He only nodded once, as if he'd expected it. As if he'd known from the beginning that the boy wouldn't stay caged. Not now that the door had cracked open. Their first stop was a small coastal town near Scarfea Modest, busy and, like most of the peninsula, corrupted quietly by its own trade. Behind the painted facades and marble colonnades lay brothels, gambling halls, and private quarters where the lines between desire and violence blurred beyond recognition. This was where Alexios operated not as a soldier anymore, but something stranger, more dangerous. He had contacts, former slaves, informants, servants loyal to no one but coin or conscience. Nicandros watched everything. He said little, spoke only when spoken to, but he watched faces, movements, glances exchanged. Across taverns, he had been trained to anticipate pleasure and pain alike, and now that cursed intuition served him in new ways. He could spot which boys were too quiet, which carried invisible chains in their eyes. He noticed the stiff shoulders, the cautious steps, the broken cadence of speech in those forced to mimic politeness. The mission was never named out loud. Alexios never called it a rebellion. He never used words like liberation or vengeance. That would have made it too neat, too clean. In truth, they were scavengers in a rotting world, pulling suffering children out of corners where society preferred not to look. They had no army, no banner, no noble sponsors. Only themselves and the darkness they knew all too intimately. Their first rescue was small, quiet, almost surgical. A young boy, barely 9, was kept by a merchant who passed him off as his nephew while traveling between ports. The boy's eyes were sunken, and his voice trembled every time he was spoken to. He wore fine clothes but never laughed. Nicandros recognized it instantly. That was a boy living by someone else's permission. It took them 5 days. They waited, watched the house, studied the merchant's routine. One night, under the cover of a festival, while wine flowed freely and fireworks lit the sky, Nicandros slipped through a servant's door. His body moved without thought-trained steps. Silent breathing, no hesitation. He found the boy curled on a mat in a corner room, hugging a cracked wooden doll. He said only one thing, "Come with me." The boy followed. They left without being seen, blending into the crowds, firelight dancing on their cloaks. The merchant never found them. By morning he had already left the town, likely convinced the child had run off or been stolen by bandits. Either way, the world would not mourn the loss. The boy's name was Philin. Alexios left him with a baker's family in a hill village. 3 days away, people who had lost a son to fever and never stopped setting an extra plate, Philin cried. When Nicandros left, he clung to his leg like a shadow, refusing to let go. Nicandros didn't know how to say goodbye. He only placed the dull knife Parmenion had given him in the boy's small hands and whispered, "You will not be a thing. You will be a boy again." Philin nodded, his lip trembling. Alexios and Nicandros rode on with each town they passed. The stories changed. Some boys were locked in cellars, sold to old generals with high titles and no heirs. Some served as errant runners for wine dens, barely clothed, treated like moving furniture. One had no tongue. Another was blind in one eye. Most never asked for help. They had forgotten how to. Nicandros became the one who saw them. He entered homes pretending to be a servant, posing as a courier, once even as a dancer in a public bathhouse. He knew how to blend in, how to bow just right, how to let rich men believe what they wanted to. And in doing so, he learned something terrifying. There were many like Diodorus. The philosopher had seemed like the worst of men, but in truth, he was only one of many hands in a wide, silent network. Not organized, not officially, but connected by wealth, status, and the belief that bodies were property. Some whispered about circles in Athens, places where boys and girls were dressed in gold chains and paraded before masked patrons like livestock at a feast. Others spoke of villas near Delphi where orphaned children were raised like crops, educated just enough to serve, not enough to escape. Every rescue came with a cost. They couldn't save everyone. Sometimes they were too late. Sometimes the house had moved on. Once they found a boy locked in a room with no windows, only to discover he had died days before. Starvation, infection, it didn't matter. Nicandros buried him with his own hands. He didn't weep, but he didn't speak for 3 days. Alexios said nothing, just rode beside him through the hills, matching his silence with silence. The boy's name was never learned. No one even remembered when he had arrived at the house. No records. No parents searching. Just another lost life crushed beneath the marble. Beauty of a decaying world. But Nicandros remembered his face, and that memory burned brighter than any fire. In time, others joined them. A woman named Irene, once a noble's concubine, now wielded knives and lies like poetry. A former cook named Myron, who had smuggled boys out of his master's home hidden in flour sacks. A runaway slave who only called himself Lee, silent, ruthless, and kind in the strange, quiet way that only those who've survived horrors can be. They didn't call themselves a rebellion, but that's what they became. Not a revolution. Not yet, but a sickness in the rot. A question whispered in the back rooms of cities. Where are the boys going? A merchant's wine shipment delayed. A senator's favorite page gone missing. A household servant vanished in the night. Whispers grew. They became shadows. And once a possession, once a boy sculpted into silence, now stood taller, voice firmer, hands calloused from more than sweeping. He had learned to fight not with swords, but with planning, with patience, with presence. He didn't scream for justice. He acted still. He never forgot the villa, the marble floors, the scent of myrrh at night, the name Theron echoing in his mind like a song with no ending. He still dreamed of Diodoros. And in those dreams, the philosopher was not angry or cruel but smiling. That was worse. That smile, the same one he wore when quoting Plato, stayed in Nicandros's thoughts like rot beneath the skin. One night, as they camped by a stream, Alexios spoke across the fire. You want to go back? Nicandros didn't answer immediately. I don't mean the village, Alexios said. I mean the villa. Him. Nicandros stared at the flames. I want him to know I lived. Alexios nodded. That might be enough. Nicandros shook his head slowly. It's not. And somewhere, far away, in the city of Larissa, Diodoros the philosopher still lectured about beauty and form, still drank wine from silver cups, still sat beneath painted ceilings while the world applauded his words. He didn't know that one of his creations was coming back, not as a boy, but as the echo of every child he had silenced. The wind that swept across the Thessalian plains was not the same as the wind Nicandros remembered from his childhood. It no longer carried the scent of fig trees and fresh bread, but was heavy with dust, memories, and things long buried. As they neared Larissa, the very city from which he had once vanished, in silence Nicandros felt each breath tighten in his chest, not with fear, but with the weight of something heavier. Purpose. It had been nearly 5 years since he had escaped Diodoros' villa. 5 years of unlearning the chains woven into his gestures, of pulling boys from silence, of cutting through the illusions draped over power. And now, after countless nights of whispered rescue and cautious flight, he was returning not as a servant or a possession but as someone shaped by suffering, sharpened by rage, and finally free. Yet freedom was not enough. Not anymore. They entered the city under cover of dusk, their faces shadowed by cloaks, their steps careful and calculated. Alexios walked beside him, as always, eyes scanning the narrow alleys, counting patrols, watching for familiar insignia. He didn't need to say what they both knew. This was the most dangerous city they had entered together. Not because of soldiers, or bounty hunters, or even the men who made slaves of children, but because of memory. Because every corner of Larissa held pieces of Nicandros's past, and not all of them had been buried. Diodoros still lived. That much they knew from Lys, who had returned weeks earlier with a folded scroll tucked into his sleeve. The philosopher had moved only slightly from his old villa on the hillside to a more secluded estate behind the Acropolis. His wealth had grown, his lectures had turned to writing, and his parties had become smaller, quieter, more exclusive. It wasn't hard to guess what that meant. The guests were fewer, but the games were the same. Nicandros sat in the dark of their rented chamber that first night, unmoving, staring into the flickering flame of the oil lamp as if he might burn away every trace of what had been done to him. Irene, now a master of disguise, braided her hair in the corner and watched him without speaking. She knew that silence. She'd worn it herself once. "You sure you want to face him?" she asked finally. Nicandros didn't look up. "I've already faced him." She nodded. "Then what do you want?" He turned to her slowly. "I want him to lose everything." It was not said with hatred, not with theatrical venom, but with the cold certainty of someone who had stared into a life of injustice and decided it would no longer go unanswered. They spent the next few days laying the groundwork. Larissa was not as bustling as Athens, nor as opulent as Corinth, but it was deeply entrenched in its own hierarchy. The men who ruled it were men like Diodoros, wealthy, educated, untouchable. You did not accuse them, because there were no judges who would. Listen, you did not fight them, because their violence was never loud. It came in the form of vanished witnesses and discredited slaves. But Nicandros had no reputation to lose. He had no name that society would mourn. That made him dangerous. They began by finding the current servants of the estate. It was easier than expected. One of the kitchen boys, a thin, limping youth named Azan, was already halfway to rebellion. His friend had vanished 2 weeks prior after being gifted to a visiting noble, and Aeson had begun hiding spoiled food in the storage cellar as a way to sabotage meals. It wasn't much, but it was something. Erin made contact. She told him the truth, not all of it, not at first, but enough, that they wanted to bring down the man behind the marble walls. That Diodoros was not a philosopher. He was a trafficker of children, dressed in robes of reason. Aeson didn't take much convincing. "I want to help," he said on the third night. "But if I'm caught, you won't be," Nicandros said, emerging from the shadows. Aeson's eyes widened. You look like him." Nicandros tilted his head. "That's because I was him." From that moment on, they worked together. The plan wasn't dramatic. No daggers in the night. No fire and fury. That would have given Diodoros the chance to play victim, to twist the narrative as men like him always did. They needed truth, and they needed witnesses. Irene began spreading whispers in the city, delicately, carefully. Tales of a villa on the hill where boys vanished, of noblemen with peculiar tastes and long-standing friendships with Diodoros. She did not name him, not yet. But the stories caught, as stories always do when they strike near someone's private shame, least bribed a local scribe to dig into shipping manifests. Several names emerged, merchants who had delivered gifts from outlying villages to the estate. Nicandros recognized one of the names immediately. It was the man who had purchased him, the first slaver. The circle was tightening. Alexios reached out to a magistrate's clerk, a bitter man with an empty purse and a dying son. Through him, they arranged a formal hearing, not an accusation, not yet, but a request to investigate property ownership and tax records. It was a smokescreen, but it bought them time and placed Diodorus's name in the ledgers of the city again, not as a scholar, but as a man of interest. Still, Diodorus did not panic. He was too seasoned, too arrogant to fear rumors. But he did grow cautious. Aeson reported new locks on the doors, less wine at the symposiums, more guards. That's when Nicandros made his move. It was the festival of Thesmophoria, when most of the city's elite left for the countryside to worship Demeter and honor fertility rites. The villa would be quiet, nearly empty. Diodorus remained behind, likely believing himself above such old traditions. Nicandros entered alone. He knew every hallway, every turn, every groaning stair and creaking door. The scent of myrrh still clung to the draperies, and the marble floors gleamed with the same dull perfection. Nothing had changed, not even the silence. He waited in the hall outside the study, the one lined with statues of faceless youths. He had once been one of them, carved by memory, polished by obedience. When the philosopher emerged, robe drawn lazily over one shoulder, holding a scroll in one hand and a cup in the other, he did not recognize the figure in the shadows, not at first. But then the torchlight caught Nicandros's face, and Diodorus stopped walking. His expression didn't change. It remained calm, analytical, curious. Nicandros, he said softly, tasting the name like old wine. I had thought you dead. Nicandros stepped forward, the dull knife hidden beneath his cloak. No, you only hoped I was. Diodorus raised an eyebrow. You've grown. You look, don't say beautiful. The philosopher's smile flickered. So you've come to kill me? No, Nicandros said, his voice steady. I've come to watch you fall. And then, behind him, the door creaked open and 3 figures entered. Alexios and the magistrate's clerk, dressed in formal robes, holding a city seal. The trap had been laid. Aeson had left the door open. The clerk had brought a city witness, and Diodorus, in his arrogance, had left every record, every name, every payment. In scrolls too old to burn without drawing attention, it wasn't enough to convict him publicly. The law would protect him still, but it was enough to ruin him by morning. The city was whispering not just about a villa on the hill but about Diodorus himself. The philosopher who spoke of virtue while buying silence. The teacher who gifted wine but trafficked flesh. The man whose name had graced stone, now soiled by ink. Students stopped attending his lectures. Merchants declined his propitations. Servants refused to return. He was not arrested. That would come later, perhaps. Or not at all. But his power was broken, and when he sat alone in that villa, listening to the echo of empty halls, he saw only one face, Nikra, us, the boy he had tried to erase. The boy who now walked freely beneath the sky, no longer a shadow, no longer a thing. There is a silence that follows the breaking of chains. Not the silence of fear or the silence of defeat, but the silence of aftermath, of breath returning to a chest long collapsed. And in that silence, in the flickering space between vengeance and purpose, Nicandros stood at the edge of Diodorus's estate, watching the city below shift beneath the weight of revelation. The old philosopher was not gone, not yet. Men like him rarely vanished in flames, they crumbled in pieces. Reputation, then wealth, then voice. And though Diodorus still lived behind marble walls, attended by 2 remaining slaves, too broken or terrified to run, his kingdom was fading. Nicandros did not celebrate. There was no feast, no cheers, no shouted slogans. Their victory had been careful, calculated, and incomplete. "We've only wounded the beast," Alexios said that night, sitting with his back to a crumbling wall outside the city, sharpening a blade that had not tasted blood in months. "He'll try to rebuild. Maybe not here, maybe not under his name, but men like him always find new masks." Nicandros nodded. He knew. That was why the mission could not end. Lys had gone east. Rumors from the Macedonian border spoke of a noble state that had suddenly begun accepting orphans for training, an elite academy that promised to discipline wild youth. The words were dressed in noble intention. Nicandros heard only echoes of Diodorus in them. Irene left for Delos, where she had once been sold at 13 to a merchant whose ships now flew flags of silver and silk. Her purpose was clear: uncover the network, find its roots, and if needed, salt the earth behind her. And Nicandros, he returned to the places others feared to tread, not because he was brave, but because he had already lived in hell. The city of Pella, once regal and echoing with the glory of Alexander's shadow, had rotted under its own weight. Street performers danced for coins beneath broken statues. Temples leaned sideways with decay, and behind every tavern was a whisper: children disappearing, wine flowing freely for patrons who asked for company, and houses where windows were always shuttered from the inside. Nicandros walked the city without a name. He wore the cloak of an apprentice, the smile of someone looking to sell services, music, poems, entertainment. He had become what Diodorus once crafted, but now he used it like armor. Let them underestimate him. Let them believe the lie. That was how he found the door. The brothel was not marked, not officially. It was a domos in the artisan quarter, quiet, discreet. From the outside, it looked like any other stone-walled home. But inside, the air reeked of perfume and damp linen. And the eyes of the boys within glassy dulled. Train told him everything. He counted 8. The youngest could not have been more than 7. The oldest perhaps 13, but so thin and blank that age was almost impossible to guess. They moved like ghosts, practiced smiles and stiff posture, eyes flinching at sudden motion. One of them dropped a jug when a guest shouted at the door. The silence that followed was too complete. That was how Nicandros knew they were punished without sound. He didn't act right away. That night, he stayed in the city square, carving small symbols into stone, a message Irene would recognize if she passed through. A month ago, they had agreed upon symbols. Circles for children, lines for resistance, stars for safe houses. It was risky. But they had no scrolls, no maps. Just signs and memory for days. Nicandros watched. He learned the routine. when the guards changed shifts, how supplies arrived, which rooms were never locked. He befriended a potter across the street whose windows overlooked the brothel. He offered to help carry clay in exchange for tea and conversation. The potter, a lonely widow, spoke easily and watched everything. "They're always quiet," she said one afternoon, pouring warm water into a cracked cup. "Not once have I heard laughter from that house. Just footsteps. Always footsteps." Nikinan nodded. He slept beneath her porch that night, wrapped in his cloak. The old knife Parmenion had given him tied under his arm. 2 days later, Erin arrived. She didn't enter the city openly. She posed as a traveling cloth merchant, face veiled, tunic embroidered with subtle patterns that matched none of the local styles. Nicandro spotted her immediately. She sat in the square with her wares displayed on a low table. She never looked at him, never spoke. But when she packed up at dusk, one cloth was left behind, a deep blue. Its edges lined with 3 silver stitches. That was the signal. They would strike in 3 days. Alexios arrived the next night. He hadn't changed. Same worn boots, same narrow eyes, same scar across the cheekbone. But there was something tighter in his expression, now something darker. He had seen something on his journey, but he didn't speak of it. "We'll need horses for 8, he said after Nicandros told him what he had seen. "Possibly more," Nicandros corrected. "There's a cellar. I haven't seen all of it." Then 10, the plan was swift. Erin would distract the guard at the front, posing as a noblewoman looking for private entertainment. She could play drunk, seductive, or hysterical, with equal skill. Once the door was opened, Alexios would slip through the side entrance, neutralize the guards, and find the keys. Nicandros would go in last. He was the only one who knew the layout. They moved like a single breath. The brothel fell in less than 10 minutes. No one died, but the men who ran it were left, bound and gagged in the main chamber, surrounded by the very scrolls and coin pouches they had hoarded. It was important that someone find them like that. Justice wouldn't come from the law, but perhaps shame would do the job instead. Nicandros found the boys in the cellar. They were not chained. That would have left marks. But they were locked in, crowded, half asleep on musty straw. When he opened the door, none of them ran. One child looked up at him with eyes so hollow it made Nicandros feel like he was looking into a mirror of the past. "It's over," he said softly. "Come with me." Only one moved. A boy named Thalos. He stood, trembling, and held the hand of a smaller child beside him. "We're not allowed," Thalos whispered. Nicandros knelt. "You are now." That was how it always began. One step, one broken rule, one whisper of freedom. They took all 10 children by dawn. They were gone. The horses rode hard, leaving Pella behind in clouds of dust. No one followed, not yet. In a hidden vale, outside Larissa, a home waited. Iron had helped build its stone walls, a tiled roof, a garden in the back where figs would one day grow. It wasn't a sanctuary. That word was too sacred. It was a start. Thalos sat beside Nicandros that night, watching the stars blink into life. "You were one of them, weren't?" the boy asked. Nicandros didn't lie. "Yes," Thalos nodded. "But you're not anymore." Nicandros looked at the sky. "No, I'm not." "Will I ever stop remembering?" "No," he said quietly. "But one day, the memory won't own you." That night he slept beside the boy, just close enough to remind him he wasn't alone, and in the distance, beyond the hills and the ruinous cities, the wind carried the scent of smoke and murmured something else, the sound of freedom, being born, not with shouts, but with silence interrupted, with doors opened, with footsteps running the other way. The rains arrived late that year, sweeping down from the northern hills in a series of relentless gray veils. For days, the sun did not rise. The world became damp and sullen, the ground slick with mud, the trees groaning under the weight of water, the sanctuary, if one could call it, that held firm through the storm. The walls, mortared with sweat and grit, kept out the wet. The roof did not leak, and for the children inside, it was a place of unfamiliar peace. Nicandros sat near the fire, sharpening a blade that rarely saw blood. His eyes flicked now and then to the doorway, where Thalos stood, watching the rain fall like sheets over the trees. The boy had not spoken much since the escape. He ate, he slept, he responded when called, but he remained, in essence, half-vanished. It was a state Nicandros recognized all too well. He rose, tucked the blade into the cloth pouch at his side, and walked to stand beside him. "You don't have to be afraid here," he said softly. Thalos didn't turn. "I'm not afraid. I don't know what I'm supposed to do." Nicandros breathed slowly, letting the words settle. "Neither did I at first. I didn't know how to sleep unless I was told to. I didn't know how to eat without waiting for permission. Even my footsteps, I used to plan them, time them to match whoever was walking beside me." Thalos glanced up, "And now I walk however I please." The boy gave the barest flicker of a smile. "It would take time." Some of the children adapted faster, especially the younger ones, too small to fully remember. But the older ones, they carried ghosts inside them, and ghosts were hard to silence. Later that day, Erin returned with a cart full of goods: grain, dried fish, figs, and bundles of wool. Her face was streaked with road dust, and one arm was bandaged tightly at the wrist. Nicandros said nothing, but she caught the glance and waved it off. "Thief in Delphi," she muttered. "Not even one of ours. Just a fool with a sharp stick. And no patience." He helped her unload. "Any word?" he asked as they stacked jars inside the storeroom. She nodded. "Alexios made it to Thespia. There's a noble family, their 2 sons, both bought from the islands. He's planning a move next month, but he's asking for you." Nicandros froze. "Why?" Irene set a jar down gently. "Because one of the boys knows your name." He didn't answer at first. She stepped closer. "I didn't tell him anything. I don't even know what the connection is. But the boy, his name's Fedrosi, was reciting names in his sleep, over and over. And yours was one of them." The name hit like a shard of stone, not because it was his, but because someone still remembered it. When night fell, Nicandros sat alone in the common room, staring into the fire, remembering the boys he'd left behind in the villa so many years ago. Some had vanished. Others had been sold, forgotten, renamed. But a few had stayed longer than he had, quieter than he had. Fedros, the name was distant, familiar in the way that a half-heard melody sticks in the mind long after silence falls. He rose before dawn. The storm had lessened. The air thick with the scent of pine needles and wet stone. He packed light, just a cloak, the knife, some bread and olives, and told Irin to wait no more than a month. If he didn't return, she would know what to do. Thespia was 3 days' ride through the mountain passes. The path was treacherous, ridges, sharp turns, and bandits who mistook travel-worn men for easy prey. Nicandros didn't engage when they circled him on the second night. He offered no coin, no threat. He only showed them his knife and the look in his eyes. They backed away. When he reached the outskirts of Thespia, the sun had just begun to rise behind a curtain of pink haze. The city was old, seated in the low arms of the hills, its temples crumbling but proud. Music drifted from the taverns, and the market streets already buzzed with traders laying out their wares. But Nicandros moved past all that, through the servant paths, toward the district where the houses had no names, just gates and guards. Alexios met him in a grove outside the city. His cloak was soaked, his beard longer than before, but the strength in his movements had not dulled. He embraced Nicandros briefly, then led him to the hiding place, a disused wine cellar beneath a grain merchant's home. There were 2 children inside. One of them, pale and thin, stirred when Nicandros entered. Phedros, Alexios said, kneeling beside him. "This is the one you spoke of." The boy opened his eyes. They were sunken, but not empty. There was still light behind them. "Nicandros," he whispered. And then the flood came. Not from Nicandros, but from Phedros. The boy reached out, fingers trembling, and said the name again. I thought they killed you." Nicandros knelt slowly. "You remember me?" Phedros nodded, tears welling in his eyes. "You were the one who took the beatings. When the others cried, you stepped in. You told us to be quiet, to stay still. I used to think you were cruel, but then you were gone, and it was worse." Nicandros looked at him, trying to reconcile the small child he vaguely recalled with the broken thing before him. "I didn't forget you," he said. "I didn't forget any of you." Phedros closed his eyes. "You came back. I always meant to." The days that followed were quiet but full. Phedros could not walk without pain, but his wounds were healing. He had been branded not with fire, but with words. His captor, a minor aristocrat with more land than morals, had insisted on renaming all the boys under his roof. Phedros had become Ionis. Nicandros called him back from that. He stayed by his side, feeding him, helping him clean, speaking with him when nightmares struck. He learned about the others' boys still inside, ones who had replaced Nicandros's generation. It was a cycle, like grain harvest, like tax collection. Every few years, new bodies to replace the broken ones. Was already planning the next raid. But Nicandros had a different idea. "This time," he said, "we burn it." Alexios blinked. The house know the lie. He explained the plan, not just to steal the boys, not just to shame the master, but to do so publicly in front of the temple, during festival, with witnesses. Alexios hesitated. "They'll come after us." "They already are," Nicandros replied. "But we've hidden long enough. Let the city see." And so they prepared. The festival of Apollo drew thousands, traders, priests, nobles, musicians. It was the perfect distraction. While the city sang and drank, Nicandros and Alexios moved through the estate's outer wall. Irene arrived on the second day, bringing with her a forged decree, fake summons claiming that a regional magistrate demanded inspection of the house. When the gates opened, chaos followed. They moved fast. The boys were waiting, they had been told, gently, in whispered midnight moments. And when the time came, they did not scream. They ran. 10 children, 3 women, and 2 silent boys older than Nicandros had been when he escaped. All of them poured out into the streets like a tide. The townsfolk turned, saw them, heard them, and then came Nicandros's cloak off, his voice loud. This is what they do behind their walls. These are not servants, they are prisoners. He named the house. He named the master. He listed the names of vanished boys, ones who had died, ones who had escaped, ones who would never have a name again. And the city, drunk on wine and divine celebration, listened, because truth, once spoken in public, cannot be silenced so easily. Guards came. They found nothing but torn silks, empty scroll boxes, and a ledger with too many initials. The master gone, the children safe, and Nicandros standing with the others in the open square, blood on his sleeves and thunder in his voice, became more than a boy. He became witness. The news spread faster than fire in a dry field, not just in Thespia, where the streets still whispered of that morning in the square, but in the surrounding villages and cities as well. Names once spoken behind closed doors were now carved into memory with public disgrace. Aristocrats who once strolled through temples with pride now kept to the shadows, and house servants, once sworn into silence, found their courage creeping back through rumor and witness. Nicandros didn't remain in Thespia long. The escape had been clean, but clean wasn't safe. They had exposed too much, and their faces had been seen. The children they had freed needed new homes, new names, and protection from the reach of those who wanted them silenced forever. Irene took 3 of the boys west, toward Delphi, where a small network of freed women had begun building a sanctuary hidden inside a ruined bathhouse. There the old walls held echoes of laughter and steam and human touch that was not abuse. The irony was bitter but beautiful. A place once used for noble leisure now shielded the forgotten. Alexios and Phaedros traveled south to Thebes, posing as traveling tutors. The ruse worked. Phaedros could quote Homer now, and Alexios, when he wanted to, could charm even the hardest magistrate. Their journey wasn't just safe, it was strategic. In Thebes, Alexios had once served in the military, and while he'd left that life behind, he hadn't forgotten the power of a well-timed favor. Nicandros rode alone. He did not know where he was going, only that there was more work ahead. The rains followed him for 3 days, turning the dirt roads into shallow rivers. He passed towns that didn't know his name, inns that offered cold bread and colder glances. But still, he moved, quietly, steadily, across the land of his birth. And then, in the village of Hypot, something unexpected happened. He met a boy who didn't want to be saved. The town was unremarkable: dusty fields, a cracked marketplace, and a crumbling amphitheater overtaken by ivy. Nicandros had arrived to rest, perhaps to find food, perhaps just to sleep under a roof that didn't leak. He paid 2 obols for a cot in a stable loft. But before he could sleep, he saw him. The boy was sitting on a stone fence, barefoot, spinning a dull knife through his fingers with the grace of someone who had learned to fight without ever being taught. His tunic was torn, his lips cracked. And yet he smirked at passersby, like he was the prince of the road. Nicandros recognized Him instantly, not the face but the eyes. They were the eyes of a child who had seen too much, and hardened before he had grown. Nicandros approached cautiously. "What's your name?" The boy didn't stop spinning the knife. "Whatever I want it to be. Fair. But what do they call you here, Damianos? Is that your real name?" The boy shrugged. "Real enough." Nicandros sat on the edge of the wall beside him. "I'm not here to hurt you. Didn't say you were. I'm not here to take you either." The boy turned to look at him now. There was a scar across his jawline, fresh, still healing. "Then why are you talking to me?" "Because you remind me of myself." That made the boy pause. Just long. Enough for Nicandros to see the crack in the armor. Damianos rolled his eyes. "Let me guess. You used to be like me. But then you got rescued. Found a family. Decided to save all the lost little boys of Greece, right?" Nicandros didn't flinch. "Not exactly. I escaped. I was hunted. I starved, I bled. And eventually, I stopped waiting for someone to save me." Damianos squinted. "And now you save others sometimes, when they want it, and if they don't." Nicandros looked at him. "Then I leave them be." That night, he stayed in the stable loft, listening to the rain slide across the tiled roof. In the dark, he thought of Damianos, how the boy's hands had trembled when he'd dropped the knife, even as his voice stayed steady. That was the mark of someone who'd endured too much for too long. In the morning, Damianos was waiting outside the stable. He didn't say anything. Just walked beside Nicandros as he passed through the market square, pointing out which merchants cheated their weights and which ones slipped bread to hungry kids. "I'm not going with you," Damianos said as they left the town gate. "I didn't ask you to. I just want to know where you're going." "I don't know yet." Damianos kicked a rock. "Then I'll walk with you until I figure out if I like you." Nicandros smirked. "That's fair." They traveled together. For 5 days, Damianos never asked questions about the past. But Nicandros saw the signs: how he flinched when dogs barked, how he refused to sleep on his back, how he cleaned his feet with dried grass before resting. All of it ritual, all of it memory. They reached a town nestled at the edge of the Boeotian. Marchesa place, where reeds grew taller than men, and frogs sang at dusk like choirs. There, Nicandros heard the first whisper of something he hadn't expected. His name, not from a friend, not from a survivor, from a stranger. It was an old potter. In the market, leaning on a crooked cane, his voice cracked with age. He watched Nicandros pass and said, "You're the one they speak of, the ghost who takes the children." Nicandros stopped. "Takes the man," waved his cane lazily. "Not steals, not like them. You're the one who removes, who unhooks." Chains, that's the story now. Nicandros hesitated. How many have heard this story? Enough. Too many, and the authorities. The old man grinned, revealing 3 teeth. They looked the other way. At least, the ones with hearts. It was not good news. It was dangerous to be known. But Damianos smiled. "You're famous. I never wanted to be too late." That night, in the Marshland Tavern, a woman approached Nicandros with her daughter in tow. She said nothing, just placed the girl's hand in his and whispered, "Take her somewhere safe." The girl didn't cry. Nicandros looked down at her, then back at the mother. "Why?" "She was promised to a merchant. He's coming tomorrow. I can't stop it." Nicandros understood. He nodded. told Damianos to gather supplies, and before dawn, they were gone again. Now there were 3, and the journey would not be easy. But for every child they added, a new fire lit in the darkness, a new name reclaimed, a new story told not of nobility, or war, or conquest but of survival, and of a world slowly shifting under the weight of those it once tried to bury. The sun hung low over the hills as Nicandros, Damianos, and the young girl whom they now called Leda made their way through the winding paths that led to the city of Delphi. The air was thick with the scent of cedar and wet earth, and every step forward was both a step into hope and a plunge into uncertainty. Leda was silent most of the time, clutching a small wooden doll carved by her mother, her eyes wide with the wary suspicion of one who had learned that kindness was a fleeting visitor. Damianos, meanwhile, had grown more guarded, his easy smirk replaced by a watchful stillness that Nicandros knew well. It was the silence of those who carry secrets like stones in their pockets. The sanctuary in Delphi awaited, a place Nicandros had heard whispered of in his travels, a hidden refuge for those who had escaped the cruelty of men cloaked in power. The bathhouse, abandoned but not forgotten, was to be their haven, a place where broken souls could begin the slow work of healing. As they approached the town, the weight of their journey pressed heavier on Nicandros. Each step was a reminder of all they had lost and all they had yet to save. The memories of his own captivity, the endless nights of fear, the sharp sting of betrayal, the stolen innocence were a constant companion. But they were not chains anymore. They were fuel. At the gates of Delphi, Erin awaited them, her eyes sharp and bright, despite the long months of travel and hardship. She embraced Leda gently and nodded to Damianos with a rare softness. "Welcome home," she said. The bathhouse was a sanctuary, unlike any Nicandros had seen. Its high stone walls were softened by creeping ivy, and inside, the air was warm with the scent of herbs and wood smoke. The pools, once used for leisure and ritual, now held quiet reflections of new lives beginning. Here, the children were safe. Here, they could dream again, but safety came with its own challenges. The scars that no blade could cut, the memories that whispered in the dark, the fear that sometimes rose like a tide. These were battles without end. Nicandros spent long hours sitting beside Leda as she slept, murmuring stories of gods and heroes, of rivers and stars. He taught Damianos to read and write, unlocking worlds beyond their pain. And he listened more than he spoke, learning the ways of broken hearts and fragile hope. Yet, outside the walls of their refuge, the world was shifting. The men who trafficked, children, noblemen, merchants, even priests were growing desperate. Rumors of Nicandros's deeds had spread like wildfire, igniting both fear and fury. Bounty hunters stalked the roads, and whispers spoke of a man cloaked in darkness, striking swiftly and vanishing before dawn. Nicandros had become a ghost. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, a messenger arrived, a young woman, breathless, clutching a sealed scroll. She brought news from Athens. Diodoros was dead. But the power he had wielded was not. His network remained, fractured but fierce. Without their leader, they were more dangerous, reckless, unpredictable, and they had begun hunting harder. Nicandros unfolded the scroll with trembling hands. It was a summons from the Council of Elders, a demand for his presence, They wanted to speak. They wanted to bargain. They wanted to silence him. The weight of the moment settled over him like a stone. To go meant risking everything. To stay meant abandoning those who still needed him. He looked at Damianos and Lydda. Then, at Iron, we have to prepare, he said quietly. The sanctuary was no longer safe, and the fight for justice, for freedom, for survival was far from over. The dawn broke pale and fragile over Delphi, casting long shadows across the stone walls of the sanctuary. Inside, the children stirred, some still caught in the fog of dreams. Others already awake, their faces a mixture of hope and lingering fear. Nicandros moved quietly through the hallways, the weight of the council's summons pressing upon his every step. The Council of Elders was no ordinary tribunal. It was a gathering of the most powerful men in Athens, aristocrats, magistrates, philosophers, each with their own agendas, their own secrets. To stand before them was to step into the lion's den, to face the very forces that had perpetuated the system Nicandros fought to dismantle. Irene met him in the courtyard as he prepared to leave. Her eyes were fierce, unwavering. You must be careful, she warned. They will try to break you, to make you an example. Nicandros nodded. I'm not afraid. She smiled, a brief flash of warmth. You should be. He left with Damianos and Lydda in tow, their small band moving through the winding paths toward Athens. The journey was tense, the silence between them heavy with unspoken fears. As they approached the city gates, the towering walls of Athens loomed like sentinels guarding a fortress of privilege and power. The streets were alive with merchants, soldiers, and citizens, a bustling city that thrived on the blood and labor of the many, ruled by the few. Nicandros was no stranger to Athens. He had been brought here as a child, sold into a world of luxury and cruelty beneath the gilded masks of the elite. But today, he walked not as a captive, but as a challenger. The council's chambers were vast, adorned with marble columns and tapestries that told tales of gods and heroes. The men inside wore their authority like armor, their eyes cold and calculating as they regarded Nicandros and his companions. The head of the council, a man named Callias, spoke first. Nicandros, we have heard much of your actions. Children, disrupting order, inciting unrest. You stand accused of sedition. Nicandros met his gaze steadily. I stand accused of justice. Laughter rippled through the chamber. Callias raised a hand, silencing the room. Do you truly believe your cause will succeed? That you can overturn centuries of tradition with stolen boys and whispered lies? Nicandros stepped forward. The truth cannot be silenced by men who hide behind laws written to protect themselves. The children you enslave are not property. They are human. Murmurs spread among the elders. Some shifted uncomfortably, others sneered. Callias's eyes narrowed. And what would you have us do? Abolish our customs? Invite chaos into our society? No, Nicandros replied. I ask you to see the cruelty in your actions, to stop the cycle of pain and silence, to restore dignity to those you have broken. For a moment, the chamber was still. Then, one of the younger elders, a man named Themistocles, spoke. Your words are dangerous, but perhaps necessary. There is truth in what you say, Callias scowled. Do not be swayed by sentiment. Nicandros looked to Themistocles. Will you stand with me? The younger man hesitated, then nodded. The tide had begun to turn. Over the following weeks, Nicandros and his allies worked tirelessly, gathering testimonies, exposing the networks of trafficking, and rallying public support. The city's underbelly stirred, whispers turning into voices, voices into demands. Yet, the fight was far from over. Powerful men sought to discredit Nicandros, spreading rumors, threatening those who supported him. Assassination attempts were narrowly thwarted, and the sanctuary in Delphi was attacked, forcing Irene to move the children once again. Through it all, Nicandros remained steadfast, driven by the faces of the boys and girls who had suffered, and the hope that their future could be different. The struggle for justice was long and arduous, but for the first time, it felt possible. The city of Athens was a place of contradictions, glittering jewel atop a foundation cracked by shadows. While philosophers debated the nature of justice and democracy, echoed through marble halls, the lives of the vulnerable were often sacrificed. Beneath the weight of tradition and power, Nicandros, once a mere boy caught in the endless cycles of ownership and silence, had become a symbol of defiance in a world determined to forget the humanity of those it enslaved. His days were filled with meetings in hidden rooms lit by flickering oil lamps, nights spent poring over accounts and testimonies. The children from the sanctuary moved from safe house to safe house, their laughter growing louder, their steps surer. But the wounds they carried were deep, some visible. Many not, hand healing was a slow, fragile process. Damianos had transformed from the hardened street survivor to a protector, fiercely guarding the younger children with the ferocity of a lion. Leda, once silent and withdrawn, now spoke in small, bright bursts, her eyes reflecting the spark of life rekindled. Yet, the world outside remained dangerous. One evening, as Nicandros returned to the sanctuary after a meeting with sympathetic merchants, he found the stone walls scarred by fire and blood. The attackers had come under cover of darkness, leaving behind destruction and terror. Several children were missing. Panic gripped the sanctuary, but Nicandros forced himself to remain calm. The search began immediately, with every ally called upon to scour the city and countryside. The missing were found days later, huddled, frightened, but alive. The message was clear. The fight was not only ideological, but brutal. Nicandros understood this deeply. His own past was marked by violence and betrayal. And now those shadows threatened to swallow the fragile light he had helped kindle. Amidst the chaos, an unexpected ally emerged, a woman named Thalia, daughter of a prominent noble who had been quietly supporting the movement from the shadows. Her eloquence and influence opened doors previously barred, and her conviction inspired others to speak out. With her help, Nicandros arranged a public forum, a bold move in a city wary of dissent. The square filled with citizens curious and skeptical, some hostile, others hopeful. Here, Nicandros told his story, not as a victim, but as a witness and a call to action. He spoke of the children hidden in the shadows, of the lies wrapped in silk and gold, of the courage found in the smallest acts of kindness. The crowd listened, some with tears, others with anger. The forum did not end with immediate change, but it planted seeds of awareness and resistance. However, not all were willing to wait for change. One night, Nicandros received a simple note slipped under the sanctuary's door, written in a hurried hand. Meet me at the temple of Athena, midnight, alone. The handwriting was unfamiliar. Despite the risks, Nicandros went, under the moon's pale light, in the silent ruins of the temple. He found a figure cloaked in shadows. A voice whispered, "You have stirred too much. There are those who want this too, and permanently." Nicandros stepped forward, heart steady. "Who are you?" The figure laughed softly. "A friend, perhaps, or an enemy. The lines are thin." From the darkness came a hand holding a folded parchment. "This contains the names of those who protect you. Guard it well." Before Nicandros could ask more, the figure vanished into the night, leaving only questions and the weight of threats hanging in the air. Back at the sanctuary, the children sensed the tension but could not understand its source. Nicandros sat by the fire that night, eyes fixed on the flickering flames, mind racing. The war for freedom was no longer just a struggle against systems, and Manette was now a battle against shadows, and in the heart of those shadows, secrets waited to be uncovered. The days that followed the mysterious encounter at the Temple of Athena were heavy with unease. Nicandros kept the parchment close, its weight a constant reminder of the invisible threats lurking around every corner. The names written in the trembling ink represented allies and enemies alike, noblemen, merchants, even some in the city guardmen whose loyalties were as fluid as the tides. Nicandros convened a secret council. Within the sanctuary's hidden chambers, Irene, Alexios, Damianos, Telia, and a handful of trusted confidants gathered around a rough-hewn wooden table, the flickering torchlight casting long shadows on their faces. "We must move carefully," Thalia warned. "Any misstep could end this fight before it truly begins." Alexios nodded grimly. "We need to root out the traitors and protect those still at risk." But Nicandros was torn. The web of complicity was vast. To expose one would risk exposing many, and some, he suspected, were beyond redemption. The sanctuary became a fortress of whispers and guarded conversations. Children were taught to recognize danger, to trust only those they knew well. Every arrival was questioned, every departure monitored, yet, amidst the tension, moments of grace persisted. Leda taught the younger children songs of old, her voice brightening the cold stone halls. Damianos led exercises, teaching discipline and strength not just of body, but of spirit. And Nicandros, though burdened, found solace in the steady progress of healing. One afternoon, a messenger arrived with news from Thebes. Alexios and Phedros had successfully disrupted another trafficking ring, freeing dozens of children and gathering crucial evidence to present before the Athenian courts. Their efforts were gaining traction, but the enemy's desperation was growing. Nicandros knew the endgame was approaching. A plan took shape, bold, dangerous, necessary. They would confront the Council of Elders once more, this time with undeniable proof. The ledger of names, the testimonies of survivors, and the alliance of those who dared to stand against the corruption. The day of reckoning was set as preparations unfolded. Nicandros reflected on the journey, the long nights in shadowed chambers, the cold touch of chains, the warmth of newfound family. He thought of the boys and girls who had become his reason to fight, their lives intertwined with his own in a tapestry of resilience. But the fight for justice was not a battle won with swords alone. It required courage, sacrifice, and the willingness to face the darkness within and without. The morning of the confrontation dawned crisp and clear. The streets of Athens buzzed with anticipation as citizens gathered outside the marble halls, whispers spreading like wildfire. Nicandros stood at the forefront, flanked by allies and the children who had found safety in their cause. The ledger was carried carefully, a symbol of truth and hope, inside. The council awaited, their faces masks of skepticism and disdain. Nicandros spoke first, his voice clear and unwavering. He laid bare the horrors hidden beneath the cities. Grandeur the children trafficked and sold, the men who profited from pain, the system that protected them. One by one, survivors shared their stories, their voices trembling but strong. The tide turned. The council could no longer deny the truth. Measures were debated, reforms proposed. It was not a perfect victory, but a beginning. Outside, the crowd cheered, their voices carrying through the city. Nicandros looked to Damianos and Leda, their faces radiant with hope. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with peril and resistance. But for the first time, the chains of silence were breaking, and a new chapter was beginning. The victory in the council chambers was a moment of fragile triumph, but Nicandros knew all too well that real change would not come from words alone. Systems rooted in centuries of power and secrecy could not be dismantled overnight. The reform decrees passed that day were only the first stones laid on a long road toward justice. Returning to the sanctuary, Nicandros felt the weight of responsibility press heavier than ever. The children who depended on him were no longer just victims, they were symbols of hope, but also targets for those who feared upheaval. In the weeks that followed, the city began to shift. Laws were enacted to protect the vulnerable, new oversight committees formed, and public awareness grew. But beneath the surface, old loyalties and secret pacts remained. The trafficking networks splintered but did not vanish. They grew more cunning, more brutal. Nicandros and his allies adapted. 2. Talia's influence opened doors in the Senate, allowing for harsher punishments and better funding for sanctuaries. Alexios and Damianos organized patrols along trade routes, intercepting shipments of enslaved children. Irene expanded the sanctuary, transforming it into a refuge and school, a place where scars both seen and unseen could begin to heal. Yet the scars Nicandros carried himself were the deepest. Memories of his own captivity, the harsh words, the broken trust, the cold nights spent wondering if dawn would ever come haunted his dreams. Sometimes he would wake, heart pounding, only to find himself surrounded by the safe silence of the sanctuary. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Nicandros sat alone by the pool, watching the water shimmer in the fading light. Damianos joined him, silent at first, then speaking softly. "Do you think it will ever end? The pain, the fear?" Nicandros looked at him, seeing the boy who had once wielded a knife with deadly grace, now transformed into a protector, a healer in his own right. "I don't know," Nicandros admitted, "but I believe it can change. We are the ones who carry the light now." Damianos nodded, eyes fixed on the rippling water. Leda approached, her small hand slipping into Nicandros's. "You saved us," she whispered. Nicandros smiled, a rare, genuine smile. "We saved each other." The sanctuary was no longer just a place of refuge. It was a home. But even homes have walls, and sometimes walls can keep danger close. One night, A messenger arrived bearing grave news. A convoy carrying children destined for the city's elite had been intercepted. The children were safe, but the leader of the convoy had escaped. Rumors swirled that he was seeking revenge. Nicandros knew that the fight was far from over. As dawn broke, he prepared to leave the sanctuary once more, this time to hunt the shadows. Threatening the fragile peace they had won. With Damianos and Lyda at his side, he stepped into the rising sun, ready to face whatever darkness awaited. For in the tragedy of the past lay the promise of the future, future carved by those brave enough to fight for it. The road from Delphi to Athens stretched long and winding, a ribbon of dust and stone that cut through olive groves and barren hills. Nicandros rode with a sense of urgency, the dawn's chill biting at his skin as thoughts swirled in his mind. The message about the escaped convoy leader was more than a warning, it was a call to action. Behind him, Damianos kept pace, his expression taut with the weight of their mission. Lyda rode quietly, clutching the small carved doll that had become her talisman through years of hardship. Together, they were a small but determined force against a tide of darkness that threatened to engulf them all. Athens welcomed them with its usual mix of splendor and tension. Statues of gods and heroes gazed down from marble pedestals, their faces immortal yet indifferent to the suffering beneath their watch. Markets buzzed with life, but beneath the surface, whispers of fear and anger pulsed like a heartbeat. Nicandros moved quickly, meeting with informants and allies who had vowed to aid in tracking the escaped Dionysius, a traitor with a network of contacts, and Helena, a former servant turned spy. Their knowledge of the city's underbelly was invaluable. "We don't have much time," Helena warned, her eyes sharp. "Dionysius's men say the leader is rallying forces. He's gathering those loyal to the old ways, men who profit from the silence." Nicandros clenched his fists. The man wasn't just running. He was planning to strike back, to reclaim what he believed was lost. The hunt led them through the shadowed alleys of Piraeus, the bustling port district where ships from across the Mediterranean brought good sand people to the city. Here, the old networks still thrived beneath the veneer of commerce. One night, beneath the flickering light of a lone oil lamp, Nicandros confronted the Dionysius's informant had been right. The leader was a towering figure named Cadius, cruel and cunning, with scars that told stories of battles fought in darkness. "You think you can stop what's already begun," Cadius sneered, stepping from the shadows. "Athens belongs to men like me, to those who understand power." Nicandros met his gaze without flinching. "Athens belongs to all its children, not just the ones who buy and sell their flesh." Cadius laughed, a sound like grinding stone. "Idealism is a luxury, and you're just a ghost story told to scare children." The confrontation ended, without bloodshed, but the message was clear. Cadius would not yield easily. Returning to the sanctuary, Nicandros knew the fight was escalating. He called for a gathering of all their allies, those who had risked everything to stand against the shadows. Plans were made to disrupt the trafficking networks further, to expose their operations publicly, and to protect those still vulnerable. But the battle was not only external. Damiano struggled with nightmares that clawed at his mind, memories of chains and cold stone. Lyda, too, wrestled with fears that made her small frame tremble. Nicandros devoted himself to their care, knowing that the scars of the past would take as long to heal as the war itself. One evening, as the sun set behind the Acropolis, casting a golden glow over the city, Nicandros stood atop a hill overlooking Athens. The city was alive with possibility and peril, a place where history was being written by those who dared to defy it. He whispered a vow to the night sky, promised to fight until every child was free, until the shadows were no more than whispers on the wind. The road ahead was long, but for the first time, it was lit by the steady flame of hope. End of Part 14. The dawn in Athens was brisk and clear, the air charged with the tension of unseen battles. Nicandros awoke to a city that was both vibrant and fragile, caught in the crosshairs of change and resistance. Every stone seemed to hold a conquest, betrayal, hope, and despair. The sanctuary, nestled away from prying eyes, was a hub of tireless activity. Children played in the courtyard, their laughter a fragile shield against the darkness they had escaped. Yet Nicandros knew that laughter alone could not protect them. Damianos, ever vigilant, oversaw training sessions that built strength and confidence. His transformation from a wary survivor to a steadfast guardian was nothing short of remarkable. Leda, with her growing voice and radiant spirit, helped nurture the younger children, teaching them songs and stories that wove a tapestry of culture and resilience. Nicandros's days were filled with meetings and plans, but he never lost sight of the heart of his mission, the children. He made it a point to spend quiet moments with each of them, listening to their fears and hopes, offering comfort and guidance. One afternoon, a messenger arrived bearing troubling news. A shipment of enslaved boys had been sighted near Corinth, destined for markets far beyond Athens. The traffickers were ruthless, their reach extending across the seas. Nicandros knew that swift action was needed. He gathered a small team, including Alexios, Damianos, and Helena, and set out under the cover of night. Their journey took them through rugged terrain and shadowed forests, each step fraught with danger. At Corinth, they discovered the traffickers' camp, a grim encampment hidden in a valley, guarded by men armed with swords and cruelty. The children held there were gaunt and terrified, their eyes reflecting years of suffering. The rescue was perilous. Under the veil of darkness, Nicandros and his team struck swiftly. They moved like shadows, disabling guards and freeing the captives. The air was thick with tension and the sound of hurried footsteps in the chaos. Nicandros found a boy no older than 10, trembling in the corner. Their eyes met. A moment of recognition passed between them, a silent promise of safety. The escape was narrow but successful. The freed children were brought back to the sanctuary, where they received care and compassion, but the victory was bittersweet. Nicandros could not shake the image of the boy's haunted eyes, nor the knowledge that countless others remained trapped in darkness. Back in Athens, the political climate was shifting. The Council of Elders faced mounting pressure from citizens and philosophers alike. Discussions of reform grew louder, challenging traditions long held sacred. Thalia's voice echoed in the Senate chambers, her eloquence stirring debate and inspiring action. Yet opposition remained fierce. Many feared that change would unravel the delicate balance of power. Nicandros found himself at the center of a storm, not just of politics, but of morality and humanity. As the sanctuary blossomed into a symbol of hope, Nicandros wrestled with his past, the boy who had once been a concubine, a prisoner, a shadow. The memories of pain and loss were etched into his soul, but they also fueled his resolve. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in hues of purple and gold, Nicandros stood with Damianos and Leda beneath the stars. They spoke softly of dreams and fears, of a future where no child would suffer as they had. The path was uncertain, the battle ongoing, but in their hearts burned a fire that no darkness could extinguish. For in the tragic life of a male concubine in ancient Greece, there was also a story of courage, resilience, and the unyielding pursuit of freedom. The sanctuary had become more than a refuge. It was a beacon. Word spread across the city-states, whispered in the markets and taverns, carried on the winds to distant villages. Stories of a man who dared to defy the cruel systems of ancient Greece, rescuing boys and girls from the shadows, reached ears both eager for change and desperate to maintain the old order. Nicandros felt the weight of this reputation keenly. Each new rescue brought hope, but also increased danger. The men who trafficked children were relentless, their networks sprawling like a dark web that no single hand could unravel. Damianos and Leda, now young adults, had grown into fierce protectors. Their strength and compassion became pillars of the sanctuary. But with every victory came the haunting question: how many more were out there, still lost? Amidst these challenges, Nicandros found allies in unexpected places. Philosophers who once debated justice from afar now spoke openly of human dignity. Merchants risked their fortunes to support the cause. Even some members of the council began to question the practices they had long accepted. Yet, resistance was fierce. Powerful families whose wealth depended on silence unleashed propaganda and intimidation. Nicandros and his companions faced threats, not just to their lives, but to their very mission. One winter's night, as snow dusted the hills, a messenger arrived, bearing dire news. The sanctuary had been betrayed. A trusted guard, swayed by gold and fear, had revealed their location to enemies. Before dawn, flames consumed the old bathhouse. Children screamed, scrambling through smoke and ashes. Nicandros fought through the chaos, guiding as many as he could to safety. The loss was devastating, but it ignited a new resolve. The sanctuary would rise again, stronger and more hidden, built on the foundations of trust and love. Nicandros stood amid the ruins, the cold biting at his skin. His heart ached for the children, for the innocents lost, for the battles still to come. But he knew this was only a chapter in a longer story, a story of pain and perseverance, of shadows and light, of a world slowly awakening to the truth. With Damianos and Leda by his side, Nicandros vowed to rebuild not just the sanctuary, but the hope it represented. For the tragic life of a male concubine was not just a tale of suffering, but a testament to the unbreakable spirit of those who dared to fight for freedom. The ruins of the sanctuary smoldered for days, the wind carrying the scent of charred cedar and scorched cloth through the hills like a morning song. Nicandros stood vigil through each sunrise and sunset, his eyes red but dry, refusing to weep. While there were still children unaccounted for, in total, they had lost three young boys who had once been found shivering behind taverns or sold along the southern coast. Their names Hector Lysandros and Petros were carved into stone markers at the base of the olive tree Nicandros had planted years ago. They had died not in the streets, not in chains, but in a place meant to be safe. And that failure, though not his alone, weighed heavier than any wound Nicandros had borne. But grief could not hold him for long. There was too much still to do. Damianos, now 20, and taller than Nicandros by a hand's breadth, organized the relocation with efficiency and fire in his voice. He carried the younger children in his arms, stayed awake for 3 nights without rest, and threatened any man who dared speak of surrender. Lita was everywhere at once, tending to wounds, calming the frightened, leading them in chants of comfort. During the darkest hours, she had once been the quiet one, broken by the promise of sale to a merchant she had never met. Now, she led like a queen born of ash and fury. They did not rebuild in Delphi. They moved east, into the hills near Plataea, where the remains of an abandoned temple offered shelter and high ground. There, amidst ancient stone columns and wildflower-choked courtyards, a new sanctuary rose. This one had no name. Its location was kept secret, even from most allies. They rebuilt with more than stone and wood. They rebuilt with purpose. Each room was designed not just to house, but to heal. Sunlight was invited in. Walls were painted with myths and songs. The older children helped raise the younger ones. And for the first time, the sanctuary included classrooms, not just for reading and numbers, but for law, philosophy, rhetoric. Nick knew that to destroy a system, you had to raise a generation who could speak against it not just with fists, but with voices. In Athens, Thalia worked tirelessly. She brought tales of the sanctuary to the Senate floor, not by name or location, but through testimony, through statistics, through raw humanity. Her speeches rippled through the city like an underground river, but the forces of the old order were rallying. In Corinth, raids resumed. In Rhodes, Nicandros's name was banned from public discourse. Pamphlets were burned. Accusations were hurled. One councilman even called him a threat to the natural order. Nicandros took that as a compliment. He traveled often now, moving through the underground networks like smoke, visiting hidden safe houses, ensuring the lines of resistance remained strong. He met with ship captains who ferried freed children to safer lands, with mothers who pretended their sons were sick to protect them from being taken, with artists who carved stories of survival into stone amphorae and left them in marketplaces for all to see. And in his travels, he met others like him, survivors, some older, some younger. Each carried stories of degradation, of luxury turned cruel, of nights spent staring at walls, hoping anyone would come through the door, not with desire, but with mercy. Some had scars. Others had smiles so tight they looked painted on. He sat with them, listened. Never asked them to speak unless they wanted to. He didn't need to ask. He already knew. In one village, he met a former concubine named Meliton, who had once been kept by a magistrate in Sparta. Meliton had escaped, fled into the mountains, and lived alone for years. Now, he tended goats and wrote poetry in the sand. "You're Nicandros," the man said, not as a question. "I am." Meliton stared at him for a long time. "You're doing what none of us could." "I'm just doing what must be done." "No," Meliton whispered. "You're giving us back our names." That night, Nicandros stayed in the village square, under a sky full of stars. The goats bleated in the distance, and Meliton's sand poetry washed away with the breeze. But Nicandros remembered every word. He thought often of his own name, of the one given to him at birth, the one stripped from him in youth, and the one now carried in whispers across the Aegean. Nicandros, the one who triumphs over victory. How ironic, he thought, to be named after conquest, when all he wanted was peace. But perhaps it was fitting after all, for each child rescued was a victory, each trafficker brought to justice, each law changed, each story told in truth. That was conquest of another kind, not of people, but of pain in the new sanctuary. Children began to laugh again, and Nicandros, haunted, hardened, but not broken, continued to fight. For those who still waited in chains, for those who had died nameless, and for a future where the term concubine would no longer be whispered with shame, but remembered only in sorrowful stories that began with tragedy and ended with hope. The winds that swept across the hills of Plataea carried with them the quiet murmur of change. The sanctuary, rebuilt from fire and memory, now stood firm among the scattered ruins of forgotten gods, where once temples echoed the names of Zeus and Apollo. Now the voices of children carried through broken columns and overgrown courtyards, voices no longer trembling with fear, but steady with newfound purpose. Nicandros stood at the highest terrace of the sanctuary, watching the children below. He saw them chase each other through wildflower gardens, heard them shout in playful argument, and for a moment, he allowed himself the rare privilege of stillness. Peace was always temporary, but it was not meaningless. Even so, the world outside the sanctuary's walls stirred with unrest. Athens had become a city split down its spine. On one side, reformers like Thalia, merchants who had turned against the old systems, and even a few cautious philosophers championed Nicandros's cause. On the other, the aristocracy, the proud, pale men who had ruled for generations without question, fought bitterly to keep control. Their tactics had shifted. No longer open with their resistance, they turned to quieter tools, forged documents, rigged trials, subtle poisonings, and most dangerous of all, whispers. Whispers that Nicandros was building an army, that he sought to overthrow the council, that he had ambitions of power himself, and though untrue, the rumors gained traction. Some citizens, fatigued by the endless struggle, began to question the cost of change. They asked whether one man's justice was worth the unrest it caused. Nicandros heard these murmurings from merchants in the agora, from tired guards in taverns, even from former allies who hesitated now to be seen too close to him. It did not surprise him, but it hurt. Even Damianos noticed it. "You gave them everything," he said one evening, sharpening a dagger by firelight. "And still they ask if you're dangerous. They fear what they don't understand," Nicandros replied, "and they don't understand freedom." Still, the sanctuary could not wait on the world's permission to exist. It moved forward. Children were taught their letters, their history, the stories of those who had suffered and survived. Nicandros encouraged every child to know where they had come from, and, more importantly, to imagine where they might go. One child in particular, a boy named Parmenion, caught his attention. Bright-eyed and thin as a reed, he had been found in a Thessalian marketplace, chained to a column as an example of disobedience. Now, he devoured books with furious hunger, memorized speeches, and wrote poetry that left even the adults quiet. "I want to speak before the council one day," Parmenion declared, unprompted. As Nicandros passed him in the corridor, Nicandros stopped. "Why?" "So they'll hear us," the boy replied. "Not just from you, but from all of us." Nicandros said nothing, but a lump rose in his throat. He placed his hand on the boy's shoulder and nodded. And in that moment, he knew the future would not belong to him. It would belong to those who came after. But the present still did, and the present brought news. Helena arrived from Athens under cover of night, her cloak soaked from rain, her face drawn tight with urgency. "They've arrested Thalia," she said without ceremony. "Charged with treason, conspiracy to undermine public order." Nicandros stood still, the fire crackling behind him. "Where is she?" "In the old prison beneath the Acropolis. They'll try her within the week." Nicandros turned to Damianos. "Rally our people. Quietly, I'll go ahead." Damianos frowned. "You'll go alone. She's only alive because they want a spectacle. If they knew I was coming, she wouldn't last the night." Nicandros left that same hour. He traveled under a moonless sky, slipping past patrols and checkpoints, guided by the shadows he had once feared and now called friends. Athens greeted him like an old wound familiar, tender, and always threatening to split open. He moved through the underbelly of the city, reaching out to trusted allies. The network was smaller than it had once been, but still alive, still loyal. On the third night, under a veil of rain, Nicandros approached the prison. It loomed at the foot of the Acropolis like a buried secret, its walls thick with mildew and silence. The guards were bored, inattentive. He slipped past them like mist. Thalia sat in a damp cell, her hair tangled, her robes torn but her eyes sharp. "You came," she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Nicandros knelt beside her. "I'm getting you out." "No," she said, shaking her head. "Not yet, not this way. They'll kill you. Not if we expose them first." She handed him a small bundle letters, transcripts, bribes, names, proof of the council's dealings with traffickers, of their attempts to silence reformers. "They thought I wouldn't smuggle these out," she said, smiling bitterly. "They underestimate us." Nicandros took the bundle and left her behind. It broke him to do so, but she was right. To strike now, recklessly, would only affirm the lies spoken about them. He returned to Plataea, where Damianos had gathered a silent army not of soldiers, but of voices. Within days, they flooded Athens with the truth. Pamphlets were distributed, walls painted with messages, testimonies read aloud in the markets. The names of powerful men became ash in their own mouths, and before the council could control the narrative, Thalia was freed, her trial dissolved under the weight of public outcry. She emerged, not broken, but blazing. Her next speech on the Senate floor was remembered for centuries. And beside her, Nicandros stood not as a savior, not as a soldier, but as a survivor who had given his pain to a cause greater than himself. But even now, as change rippled through the marble streets of Athens, the work was far from finished. Nicandros knew that somewhere across the islands, in quiet homes, in dark halls, children still wept for rescue. He would not stop until their voices were heard, and neither would those he had once saved. The air in Athens had changed. Where once fear curled in alleyways and justice echoed faintly beneath the weight of wealth and privilege, now there was movement. A current, something that could not yet be named but was impossible to ignore. Nick walked the agora under the watchful eyes of marble gods, the hem of his cloak damp with morning dew. Strangers nodded to him, some in gratitude, some in curiosity, and some in veiled contempt. But none turned away. Not anymore. Thalia's exoneration had stirred the soul of the city. Her words in the Senate rang like a war drum for reform. The council, cornered by proof of its own corruption, had no choice but to yield slightly, temporarily. A few resignations followed. A handful of decrees were suspended. Committees were formed. The city was trying to cleanse itself, though not without protest. But Nicandros knew this too well. Wounds that festered for generations did not close with salves and speeches. He returned to the sanctuary, just before the first spring rains. There, in the green hills above Plataea, the children had planted their first garden. Tiny rows of vegetables sprouted between stones, and laughter once again filled the air with the careless joy of safety. Yet safety, he reminded himself, was never permanent. That night, as he stood alone by the edge of the courtyard, Leda approached. She had grown now, a young woman, her voice steady, her step confident. Her eyes, once wide with fear, now held only calm. "You should rest," she said softly. "I can't," he replied. "You've done more than anyone ever asked of you." "Not enough," he murmured. "Not yet." She sat beside him. "You gave us back our names. You taught us we were more than what was done to us." He said nothing. There were no words that could accept such a gift without cracking under the weight of its truth. Later that week, a delegation arrived from Euboea women who had once sent their sons to the city in quiet shame, believing it was the way of the world. Now, they came with stories. Some wept, some burned ledgers and receipts. Some simply stood in silence and looked into Nicandros's eyes as if trying to undo the past by meeting the gaze of the future. One woman gave him a scroll, sealed with wax. "This is a list," she said, "of every child I helped send away. I was wrong. Do what you must with it." Nicandros took it, not as evidence, not as a weapon, but as an offering, a relic of repentance. By midsummer, the network that Nicandros had built now spanned city-states and islands. Sanctuaries bloomed in hidden valleys and temple ruins. Children escaped from brothels in Corinth, from slave ships in Mytilene, from cruel aristocrats in Thebes. They came not just to be hidden, but to be seen, and more importantly, to be heard. It was then that Nicandros realized something profound. This movement was no longer his. It belonged to them too, Damianos, to Leda, to Parmenion, and to the countless others who were once just shadows. They no longer needed his protection. They needed his story. So he began to write in the quiet hours before dawn. He etched his memories onto parchment, not to immortalize himself, but to document what had been done and what had been overcome. Every humiliation, every scar, every moment of defiance. He wrote the names of those lost, not as victims, but as witnesses. And he wrote of those who helped, of Erin's iron compassion, of Alexius's wild loyalty, of Thalia's blazing words. Word of his writings spread. Scrolls were copied and passed from port to port, read aloud in secret meetings and whispered in schools. Children who had never known the taste of chains read those words and wept for those who had. And from their tears, understanding began to bloom. But with attention came risk in the shadows. Remnants of the old order conspired to destroy what they could no longer control. A nobleman's son, caught trafficking in Delos, claimed the reforms had corrupted the moral fabric of Greece. Others called Nicandros a heretic, a poison, a threat to tradition. So he did something no one expected. He returned to Athens and stood in the central plaza at midday, scroll in hand, and read his story aloud. Word spread like wildfire. Crowds gathered, some jeered, many listened. And when he finished, there was silence not of dismissal, but of reverence. Then a single boy stepped forward, no older than 10, dirty, thin, alone. He looked up at Nicandros and simply said, "Me too." That boy was taken in by the sanctuary. His name was Agapitos. He would go on to write stories of his own, and Nicandros, hearing them years later, would finally allow himself to believe that the darkness might one day fade, not because evil had vanished but because enough people had chosen not to look away. The last years of Nicandros's life unfolded not in the heat of battle or the silence of chains, but in something far stranger peace. It was not the kind of peace the world promised men like him, not a golden reward handed down from marble thrones, or written into the laws of the land. It was earned, slowly, painfully, through sacrifice, memory, and the fire of truth. The sanctuary near Plataea had become more than just a refuge. It had become a school, a home, a monument to the resilience of the human spirit. Its name was never spoken in the city squares or etched into official maps, but travelers from distant islands and mountain villages somehow always found their way to its gates. They came with stories, they came with scars, and they left with something that many of them had never dared to dream of belonging. Nicandros's hair had gone silver. His back ached on cold mornings, and his hands trembled when he held a quill. But his voice never faltered when he spoke. Children, now grown, sat at his feet in the long halls of the sanctuary, listening as he read from the scrolls he had once written in secret. He spoke not only of what had been done to him, but of what he had done with it. "I am not a hero," he would say. "I am not a prophet. I am only a man who lived." Yet to those who heard him, Nicandros was more than that. He was a reminder that a single voice could echo louder than all the silence the world tried to force upon it. Damianos, now a man of 35, had taken charge of security and outreach, leading missions across the Aegean to identify and dismantle the last remnants of the trafficking networks. He wore his age in the lines around his eyes, not from years, but from remembering, from protecting, from loving a world that had once nearly broken him. Leda had become the heart of the sanctuary. She oversaw education, healing, and ceremony. It was she who held the children when they wept in the night. It was she who led them through their first recitations, their first steps toward a life where no one would ever own them again. Parmenion, whose passion had once threatened to outrun his wisdom, had become a writer and orator in his own right. He toured the city-states, giving speeches in forums, temples, and even amphitheaters. His words were sharper than Nicandros's now, honed by study and tempered with fire. In one famous address delivered in Delphi, Parmenion said, "To know a man's suffering and turn away is a failure of the soul. But to listen, to stand beside him, and to speak his name back to him, That is how civilizations are saved. By then, Nicandros no longer traveled. His body could not endure the long rides and sleepless nights. But the world came to him. Survivors, senators, foreign scholars, and even poets would sit with him under the olive tree that had once been planted in memory of 3 lost boys. He always asked them the same thing: tell me who you are. Not who you were made to be, but who you are. And so they told him. Some were still learning, some were still afraid, but each left changed. One autumn evening, Nicandros took Leda and Damianos to the upper terrace of the sanctuary. The sky was streaked with crimson and gold. The valley below shimmered with the light of torches, carried by children preparing for the evening ceremony. He said nothing for a long time, just breathed, just listened. Then finally he turned to them and said, "You must promise me something." Leda looked at him. "Anything. When I'm gone, don't bury me under stone. Don't mark my name on a slab." Damianos frowned. "But the world will want to remember you." "They'll remember me in you," Nicandros said. "In the work, in the light. That's enough." They agreed, though it hurt them. And when Nicandros passed the following spring, he did so in his sleep, with sunlight on his face and a scroll resting gently on his chest. The sanctuary did not mourn him with wailing or black robes. They celebrated, they gathered under the olive tree and spoke his name aloud, not as a relic, but as a promise. Leda stood before them all and said, "He was born into a world that tried to erase him, but he lived. And by living, he taught us how to live too." Number tomb was raised. No statue carved, but in every sanctuary that sprang up after, from Delos to Nasus, from Rhodes to Chios, a small plaque was placed in the entranceway. It read, "Here, no child belongs to anyone. Here, we remember Nicandros." Years passed. Generations turned. The title concubine faded from the language. The trade that had once been cloaked in silence became openly reviled. The stories of those who had suffered were taught in schools not to shock, but to remind, and in quiet corners, by candlelight. Young men and women still read the writings of the boy who became a flame. They read not to grieve, but to understand. They read to listen, to remember, to carry the story forward, not as tragedy, but as legacy.